Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to you. My name is Richard Orme, I'm from the DAISY Consortium, and I'm your host for today's webinar. Okay, let's get started. This is the second of two webinars examining the revolution of born accessible digital publications. Our first session was entitled Publishing Accessibility W3C Standards, Where Are We and How Did We Get Here?, which reflected on the EPUB journey to become the world's most popular and most accessible digital publishing standard. This session will discuss where we currently are and some of the challenges we face, and also summarize what's planned in the near future, and gaze into the crystal ball of publishing standards to explore where we might be headed longer term. I'll be back after the presentations to moderate the questions, but at this point I'll hand over to our panelists who will introduce themselves and address the question, where are we going?
Hi, I'm Thea Siegman from Wiley. I chair the Publishing Working Group in the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, and I'm also a member of the W3C Advisory Board. I also am the lead of the Publishing Activity, which is a group of all of the publishing groups within the W3C.
My name is Dave Kramer, and I've been complaining about EPUB for almost 20 years. I work for the Big Five trade publisher Hachette. I was one of the editors of EPUB 3.2. I helped write the fixed layout spec. I was chair of the community group that created EPUB 3.2. And I hope to be the chair of the forthcoming EPUB 3 working group, which we'll talk about in this webinar.
Hi, everyone. My name is Wendy Reed, and I'm from Rakuten Kobo. I am also one of the chairs of the Publishing Working Group and aspire to be one of the chairs of the EPUB 3 working group that is upcoming, and we'll be talking about that. And I'm also the editor of the Audiobook Specification. So today we're going to be talking about a number of things that are coming up. First, we'll give an introduction of how the standards groups work and the EPUB and EPUB. We'll be talking a bit about the EPUB 3 working group, EPUB accessibility, DPUB ARIA and WCAG, and audiobooks and synchronized narration. One of the first things that we wanted to talk about was how publishing at the World Wide Web Consortium works. The publishing activity, as Fia mentioned, is a collective of a number of different groups. The main three groups right now, the three active groups, are the Publishing Working Group, which is responsible for the publication manifest and audiobook specification, the Publishing Community Group, which is responsible for incubation and idea sharing, and the Publishing Business Group, which provides a venue for the business part of our activity to discuss, share ideas, and do outreach work. They also are in charge of things like EPUB Check fundraising. Two additional groups are the proposed EPUB 3 working group, which we will talk about in a moment, and the EPUB 3 community group, which we are currently in the process of folding into the publishing community group as they finish their work with EPUB 3.2. And the one group that oversees all of this is the Publishing Steering Committee, which is a group of the chairs of all of the publishing groups and some invited advisors who we kind of come together, discuss the strategy for publishing at W3C, and do any sort of outreach in terms of where we need to talk to other groups. And if you ever wonder how does an idea kind of make its way through the publishing activity, ideas are recommended to be filtered up through the community group. The community group is a great venue for us to look at ideas, look at if they are possible, if there's room for specification, if they need to be sent to another working group like CSS or accessibility, and for us to talk about the business implications and the possibility for specification. So that's how it all works. Earlier this year, the publishing activity actually hosted a survey of the publishing industry to understand how EPUB was being used. As we were looking at our strategy for the future, we really wanted to understand what is going on in the industry. How are people using EPUB? Do people still want to use EPUB? Is it doing what it needs to do for everybody? From that data, we learned that EPUB is the format of choice. EPUB 3 in particular was overwhelmingly the majority format. Publishers like the format, but they need it to do more for them. We received requests that included things like modernizing our support for HTML and CSS, clarifying support for JavaScript, support for web APIs in the browser, and increasing information for reading system conformance via tests. This was a particularly popular one for reading system developers, as a lot of the complaints around EPUB really are about interoperability, but interoperability can really only be achieved if reading system developers know what they're trying to implement. One of the biggest things that we learned is that there's a lot of misunderstandings about EPUB, which we're hoping improvement to the spec in the EPUB 3 working group and communication through webinars like this and other activities will help fix.
So EPUB 3 seems pretty good to me. Why does it need to change? Why do we need an EPUB 3 working group? In the previous webinar in this series, my former Hachette colleague Luc Audrain described EPUB 3.2 as future-proof. But the future is hard to predict, as has become abundantly clear in the last 77 days. Luc is correct in that EPUB was designed to evolve with the underlying web technologies like HTML and CSS. Yes, EPUB 3.2 is the best EPUB ever, but there's always room for improvement. Most of us are familiar with some of the challenges of EPUB. Many features are not supported by existing reading systems. Reading systems rewrite our files for good and bad reasons. There are hundreds of reading systems with varying goals and capabilities. All of this makes interoperability a huge challenge. Next slide. So we want EPUB to be better, but now we have a new tool at our disposal, the W3C Process. The W3C has a long history of creating high-quality specs that are used around the world. 25 years of collective experience and wisdom in creating specs has been distilled into the process. There are two fundamental concepts. First, you must prove that every single feature in a specification is capable of being implemented. How do you do that? You write tests and show that at least 2 independent implementations pass the tests. This idea is very powerful. A recipe that looks good on paper might taste terrible or be impossible to make. How do you find out? You try it out. Second, the web, and by extension ebooks, are for everyone. W3C has the concept of horizontal review, where every spec is scrutinized to show it is accessible for all, works for every language and writing system, is secure, and preserves the privacy of its users. EPUB has always focused on accessibility, and EPUB 3 was partially driven by the need to expand support for many of the world's languages. But there's always room for improvement. There are also political and administrative advantages to going through the full W3C process. Governments and other standards organizations are happier with such specs. Of course, EPUB ultimately exists for the readers, not for standards bodies or governments. And we do hope to incorporate some suggestions for new features from the community. And we must also be very careful with EPUB. We don't want to break millions of existing books and cause trouble for millions of existing readers. So every existing valid EPUB 3.2 file will remain valid to whatever new version of EPUB we create. It's so new we haven't named it yet. We're calling it EPUB 3.x. Next slide, please. So what sort of work will we work on in the working group? We will be working on testing, identifying all the testable features in the spec, writing tests for those features, and running those tests in many different reading systems. As Wendy said, we also hope to clarify how reading systems are supposed to present EPUBs. The current spec says surprisingly little about the obligations of reading systems, and it's likely that this is one significant cause of our interoperability problems. And of course, we hope for a few new features. As we learned in the survey, scripting in EPUB is still confusing, and most reading systems aren't willing to implement it. I've also been hearing calls for full bleed images in EPUBs for at least a decade. So we hope to add at least a few little goodies like that, you know, without drastically changing what EPUB is and without requiring anybody to change how they create and consume EPUBs.
Thank you. Additionally, in the EPUB 3 working group, we will be taking a look at a revision and improvement of the accessibility specification. The current version of EPUB accessibility is a note, and the scope of the work on the revision of the EPUB accessibility specification is to make the EPUB accessibility 1.x a formal W3C recommendation. There's a lot of work going on right now to make sure that the EPUB accessibility specification meets the EU directive for ebooks. And along with that, we're considering new and incremental features as long as they're compliant with the EU directive, as well as WCAG 2.x. We'll be talking a little bit more about WCAG and the updates coming up to WCAG in a few slides. Some of the things we'll be looking at are fixed layout accessibility and making sure that we reference specific versions of WCAG. We're also working to make sure that we're providing clarifications and reducing ambiguity. There's a lot of information in the accessibility specification that's very specific to ebooks, and we want to make sure that this is clear documentation and not just a bunch of metadata that people are not quite sure what to do with. We're hoping to have this out by May 2021, and there's a lot of work going on in that group right now. Next slide, please. Additionally, in the accessibility task force, there's work ongoing with the metadata crosswalk. There's collaboration with other organizations, including IFLA, so that people who have accessibility metadata, publishers who have accessibility metadata, can include the same information in multiple languages, schema.org, Onyx, MARC, so that it's relevant to booksellers, to libraries, to publishers, and many other people. The work is ongoing, and there's a great deal of work happening there, and I'm sure that the people who are working on that, myself included, will be happy to share that information to you. Whatever it is that we're doing, we want to make sure that we can convey information about accessibility to as many people and those in the book industry as possible. The next topic is DPUB ARIA. Some of you may be familiar with ARIA, Accessible Rich Internet Applications, a specification that was created several years ago to make HTML, SVG, and other markup languages more accessible. Functionally, I'm going to read a paragraph here. ARIA roles, states, and properties are analogous to CSS for assistive technologies. For screen reader users, ARIA controls the rendering of their non-visual experience. Incorrect ARIA misrepresents visual experiences with potentially devastating effects on their corresponding non-visual experiences. What that is saying is that if you use ARIA correctly, it significantly improves the experience for people using screen readers. If you use ARIA incorrectly, it can have really horrible effects on those using screen readers, because the purpose of ARIA is to actually override some of the semantics that are embedded in HTML and other languages. What we did with DPUB ARIA, digital publishing, the digital publishing extension to ARIA, is add some roles to the ARIA specification, or this extension of the ARIA specification, that are specific to publishing. And they then map to the roles in the main ARIA specification. So you can say something along the lines of, this paragraph is supposed to convey the information that this is a chapter, and then it will convey to the assistive technology that this chapter has a certain structural role in the HTML. But it is very important to make sure that you can use it correctly. You can take a look at the link here, ARIA Authoring Best Practices, which is included in the links that will be provided to you by Daisy, to make sure that you're using ARIA correctly. And my recommendation is that if you're not sure how to use it, you can take a look at the Daisy Accessibility Knowledge Base for a little bit of information. And if you're not sure about how to use it, I would avoid using it completely, because as this says above, if you're not using it correctly, you will be causing more problems for your reader than you will be solving. Next slide, please. And coming soon, we'll be releasing a small update to Deepub ARIA, Deepub ARIA 1.1, and it is really a very minor update. Small bug fixes related to HTML validation, and we'll be deprecating some Deepub roles that never quite worked properly. People have been logging issues about doc endnote and doc biblioentry. Both of those are going to be deprecated, and you'll just simply replace them by using the list item tag within a parent role of doc endnotes or doc bibliography. Hopefully this will not cause any problems in your systems because you should have been getting validation errors with these all along. Next slide, please. Outside of the publishing world, there's a lot of work happening in the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group. There are updates coming to WCAG. WCAG 2.2 is expected in Q4 of 2020. That's coming up rapidly. There are a number of updates related to cognitive and learning disabilities. There's some information that came from the publishing world related to EPUB called fixed reference points, which many of us refer to as page numbers. There's information about low vision as well as mobile. Watch out for these. They're going to bring some significant changes to the work that you do. Hopefully not too significant because hopefully you're already paying attention to these, but they're really important updates and they're bringing together a lot of the world of accessibility that had not previously been in WCAG. Next slide, please. And coming up in the future is WCAG 3.0, which is the next generation of WCAG. The work for this is already beginning, and what WCAG 3.0 is doing is incorporating testing into WCAG, as well as making sure that the whole world of technology, which basically touches almost everything in our lives right now, has harmonized guidance so that we can see all of web-related technologies incorporated into WCAG 3.0. And this work is just beginning and is going to take several years to incorporate.
So one of the last things we're going to talk about today are two specifications that are currently being worked on in the publishing activity. The main one is audiobooks. Audiobooks is the specification that we designed to bring the specification to the audiobooks industry. Right now, the audiobook specification is on track to reach full recommendation status in Q3 of this year. And audiobooks is basically, because the audiobooks industry did not have a specification before this, we're trying to fill that gap, but we're also trying to ensure that the specification allows for the creation of accessible audiobooks. Using this specification, content creators can in the mainstream create born accessible audiobooks or audiobooks that maybe don't start accessible but are easy to make accessible thanks to specifications like sync narration, which I will cover in just a second. Audiobooks actually has two accompanying specification notes from community groups, the lightweight packaging format and sync narration, and this allows audiobooks to become a complete standard that is portable, informative, and accessible. The synchronized narration note is the successor to Smile for content that is built on the web. Synchronized narration is a JSON-based method for linking text and media content. For instance, in audiobooks, we use it to provide a synchronized text experience to audio, meaning that a content creator can have line by line, word by word, paragraph by paragraph linking to a text document.
Finally, we wanted to talk a little bit about some things that might be happening a little further into the future. Wendy was just talking about audiobooks. You know, those of you who work with EPUB know that, you know, all the ingredients in an EPUB are listed in this XML package file, the OPF. That's really not what the web does anymore. The web has sort of drifted away from seeing XML as, you know, a primary way of expressing information. You know, sort of JavaScript won that battle basically. And so so much information on the web now appears in the form of JSON. And so for a long time, we've thought about, could we make some sort of ebook format that was more based on the technologies the web uses today? EPUB has always been based on web technology, but it is still a significant hurdle to have to, parse these XML files and do all these other crazy things. So we were wondering, could we express the content of an ebook in JSON, thus making it easier for web developers to build web applications that would be, essentially book readers. I think the audiobook spec is sort of the first example of that happening. An audiobook consists of like a bunch of MP3 files and a bunch of metadata. And so we're expressing the metadata in a JSON file that we call a publication manifest. It's a lot like the manifest on the spine, and in EPUB it lists, here's all the pieces of the audiobook, here's what order they come in, here's how long the tracks are, here's the author and title and publisher, here's the person who read the audiobook. And so all that information is now expressed in JSON rather than XML. We sort of hoped that idea would take off for books too, but it hasn't really so far. EPUB is very entrenched in the ecosystem. There's so much investment in EPUBs and EPUB reading systems everywhere. And so we haven't really found a business need for this publication manifest. And so we're just trying to figure out where it works for now. And that first place where it works is the audiobooks. A second place this manifest might become useful is for, digital narratives like manga and comics and all those things. These are certainly currently possible and done in EPUB, but I think there are people out there who hope for much more expressive and interactive manga, which have, panel to panel navigation, much more complex transition effects, etc. So there's a community group working right now that's sort of taking that publication manifest JSON idea and creating a vocabulary to express, all the geometry you have in a complex comic or manga, and, see if they can start experimenting with that and see if that's something that might at some point get some traction in the world. It's kind of interesting work that's ongoing, but we don't have a clear idea of where it will go. On a sort of unrelated note, there's also a lot of renewed interest in better CSS, both for print and for content that often appears in pages. Most ebooks are paginated. CSS has a lot of really interesting new capabilities like Flexbox and grid and animations and 3D stuff and so on and so forth. But, those technologies haven't trickled down into ebooks yet. But there's sort of a renewed energy even among the browser vendors themselves. Google and Microsoft are sort of, and Firefox are talking about improving the support for print of, defining what happens if you split a CSS grid across pages. How could we actually do footnotes and notes in a more elegant manner than we do right now? Could we actually have control over running heads and page numbers in ebooks? there's a new community group devoted to some of these ideas, and I think that's something that at least has the potential to help make our ebooks a lot better than they are right now. Finally, Google has been working on this really interesting web packaging idea. One of the powerful things about EPUB is that you can create this file that you can distribute, that you can email to someone, that you can create yourself without having a web server, basically. And they're trying to extend this idea to sort of the web in general, that you could bundle together a whole bunch of HTML, CSS image files, but have it work directly in a browser rather than needing an EPUB reading system sort of as a middle step. The original motivation for this was for places where, the internet is not very available and there's not a lot of bandwidth, and, people would actually sort of collect the web pages of news sites and then, sell them on USB drives or set up little local beacons to sort of rebroadcast web content. But this idea has sort of expanded, and it looks like it may be possible to create sort of, standalone web applications. I've actually made an audiobook, a self-contained audiobook that I could email to you, and then you could just double click on your browser and it would be right there. No reading system, no distributor or intermediary. It seems like an idea with a lot of potential, but also there's also a lot of controversy about it because it changes the web security model in certain ways, and it's also, has interesting connections to Google's other plans for world domination. And that's what I have to say about that.
So we've talked about a lot of things in this presentation. We have included a list of links here in the slide deck, but Daisy will also be posting them on their website. The links we've provided are a link to the EPUB survey overview and the results, if anyone is interested in looking over those. A link to the EPUB 3.2 specification, the EPUB 3 Working Group charter. It is a draft right now and is open for feedback if anyone is interested in providing feedback. We have a demo of what an audiobook looks like on the web, including an implementation of sync narration. So please feel free to look at that. The accessibility metadata crosswalk, link to DPUB ARIA 1.0, and as Fia mentioned in her slides, the ARIA authoring practices. If anyone wants to get in contact with any of us, you can feel free to email any of us at our emails or reach us on Twitter. We're always happy to talk about anything related to digital publishing. Or if you want to post a question, do that here. And I guess it's discussion time.
Fantastic. Thank you. This is Richard again, and thank you, Svea, Dave, and Wendy for that great presentation. And we've plenty of time for questions. So if you have questions in your mind and you're watching this webinar, you'd like to pose them, then now's a great time to pop them into the Q&A. We're going to start with some that relate to actually the reading experience. And one is about the thing that was mentioned, which is more work being focused on the conformance of the reading systems and specifying what the behaviors of those should be. The question is, haven't we been there before with EPUB test, where there were lots of tests around reading systems and that kind of ran out of road? It didn't seem to be successful. What would make that a successful venture this time around?
I think, first of all, the epubtest.org was really focused on the features of the EPUB themselves. Does MathML work in this particular reading system? Does it support these image types? Does it screw up vertical writing mode? Things like that. But it sort of didn't address the behavior of reading systems in, like, do they display the metadata? How do they display the metadata in your package file? You know, do they show the book title? If you have 3 authors, how do they list the 3 authors? How do they handle, you know, spine items that are linear equals no? You know, do they support inline markup in the navigation document? So we're sort of hoping to clarify in the spec itself how reading systems interact with readers. And that's, I think that's largely something we haven't even really tried to think about much yet. As to the difficulty of, you know, epubtest.org did get overwhelmed, basically because there are so many reading systems and there were so many tests. And, you know, I think that's what worries me most about the working group, that we are going to have to dive into that and sort of find a better solution than what happened there.
Yeah, I would add, Dave said pretty much all the important stuff, but as someone who's run a lot of EPUB tests as a reading system tester, a lot of the tests in EPUB tests sometimes kind of came with an element of interpretation, which is not always a good thing, especially when you have very specific, you're hoping to have very specific technical requirements and they don't exist. And Dave mentioned linear no, which I think is a very good example of one where the behavior as described in the spec is not addresses more the use of how linear no should be included in an EPUB and not so much what a reading system should do with it when presented with that. So that's like one really good example. There's many, many others, but it is one big challenge for the working group is really going to be defining that behavior in such a way that reading systems and users have a good experience.
And I'll add to that as somebody who did testing for EPUB test, that there are a few aspects. The interpretation aspect was very challenging, but it also was extremely manual. Mm-hmm. And we're hoping in the working group to automate the testing. And as far as what Dave was saying in terms of the language of the specification, we have numerous statements that are should statements in the document, in the EPUB specification. And when we say a reading system should do X, often that leaves a lot of room for interpretation, and they aren't what we call testable statements. And we're going to have to make a lot of decisions in the working group about how we rewrite those statements so that they can then be interpreted into testable statements. And that is one of the largest goals of the working group. So it's not actually just the testing itself, it's revising the document so that we can actually test things.
Great, thank you. So there are some challenges ahead, but it's good to be aware of them as you go into it. The next question also relates to at least the reading experience. Wendy, you talked about the W3C Audiobooks specification. How does this relate to reading systems? Would these publications play within existing EPUB readers, or is this something completely separate?
So this is the audiobook specification is, I guess, not technically written for EPUB reading systems. I know there are a few reading systems out there that do have an accompanying player. Kobo is one of them. I definitely don't see audiobooks being read in a pure EPUB environment, and we can talk about why that is another time. I've talked about it a lot. But this really, the audiobook specification really was designed for dedicated audiobooks experiences. Though, because we have the added text element, we also wrote it in such a way that it could be implemented, depending on the reading system developers' choices. It could be implemented into an existing reading system, or it could be presented as a different experience entirely. I think it really comes, because we're really just providing a manifest format, it's really up to the reading system developers to decide how that gets presented. So there's a lot of possibilities out there, and I have some like dream-like ones, but it really is up to the developers.
Dreams and crystal balls is what we're all about on this webinar. Mm-hmm. Let's move to books on the web then. And Dave, you talked about web packaging, the desire in some use cases for people to be able to have an EPUB-like reading experience, but actually through the browser. What are your thoughts, folks, on kind of reading books on the web and that whole piece? What's your crystal ball or dreams in that space?
I think my crystal ball and my dreams contradict one another here. I certainly dream of it happening, not least because, you know, from the point of view of accessibility, I think a lot of people know their browsers really well, and, you know, it's hard to deal with a reading system that does something really differently than the browser just for this particular use case. I think what we haven't figured out is the business model around books on the web yet. I sometimes imagine, I sometimes hope maybe there's a future of sort of independent books and content that work as web publications in some sense, or as web packages, sort of outside of the, big five commercial EPUB market, which I think is likely to continue for a long time. 10 years ago, we were about to have EPUB 3, and not that much has changed in the last 10 years.
I think I agree with Dave. Dave's really the best person in the world to ask this question of, because he has created many prototypes of web publications of books in a browser. He calls them toys, but they're not. They're really great templates for what we could do in the future. The ecosystem and the business models that we have around EPUB are fantastic, but EPUB has its limitations. I work for a scholarly publisher for Wiley, and there are things that don't work fantastically in EPUB, and I don't think that they're ever going to unless we drastically change the EPUB model to something that makes better use of the web. So Dave talked before about web packaging. That is something that could really drastically change everything. We could do things with that model where it basically is just a book on a browser that you could package up using whatever functionality it is. We could do things like have linking into very specific points in a publication and share those links. In the world of scholarly publishing, citations are crucial. Right now, the APIs, the web APIs and that sort of thing that a lot of people have asked for are very difficult to do in EPUB. JavaScript would just be part of the web the way that it is on any website. But like Dave said, I don't see this changing very quickly, certainly in the world of trade. And I don't want to attempt to fracture the publishing world, but I could see this taking off in a different kind of way in scholarly publishing, or possibly even in education publishing.
Sticking with the browser just for one more question. Ted asked the question, do we see any browsers starting to warm up to supporting EPUB 3? As we know, the Edge browser supported it for a while, and then the new version came out and that was dropped. Do we see native support for EPUB in the browser as a reading system at all? Any signals around that? Ted asks.
I haven't heard anything. I think Microsoft Edge was an interesting case. I think one reason they were able to do it is that under the hood of the browser, they had technology that made doing things like pagination easier than it would have been in Chrome or something. I think some of that functionality is now going to come back to Chrome, which would make it easier for people to work with the browser to achieve these sort of publication-like effects. But I sort of doubt that the browsers themselves will be, making EPUB a native format. I don't see how it fits into their plans for world domination.
Yeah, I agree with Dave. There is a lot of there's a lot of challenges in the current modern web views with things like pagination, and it's just not so easy to create an EPUB reader. I know a lot of places a lot of reading system developers are looking at creating reading systems in web contexts, and there's a lot of work that has to be done just to make a book render the way that I think a user expects a book to render. And until the web, the browsers make that easier and have a vested interest in it, it's still a huge challenge. Though I think there is a growing interest in browser-based readers, though it's still coming from the book people and not from the browser people. Though I think Dave and I agree that we both would love to have browsers part of EPUB 3 and welcome them all the time, because it would be a really, really big change and really cool.
Yeah, I completely agree, but I will say what I expect to see before we see browsers is what we used to see with PDF, where there was kind of a plugin to read something in the browser. And it would not surprise me if we see that for EPUB.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, you mentioned the PDF term, so why don't I ask that question, because that's come through, which is that you guys, I guess, are speaking mainly with your perspective as publishers, but of course people read content from a wide variety of services and places, including public services, government bodies, and so on. And so far, we see the use of EPUB as a replacement or alternative to PDF is kind of slow in terms of taking up in that space. Can you think of reasons for that, and do you see that changing in the future?
I think one of the biggest reasons for that is just the ease of creating today, even still, it is generally easier to create a PDF than it is to create an EPUB from, say, something like however an organization is authoring their content. However, in the last, I think even just 6 months, there's been a huge flurry of, EPUB tools. For instance, Daisy's Word to EPUB plugin. Google Docs now allows you to export to EPUB. I've seen a few other tools. I'm kind of blanking on which ones right now, but the easier it gets to export an EPUB from your whatever format you're using to develop that document, because I think most people aren't, especially when you're working in government or industry, you're not writing raw HTML code for your internal documentation or reports. The easier it gets to export the EPUB format and the better those EPUBs are, the easier it's going to, I think the more proliferation we'll see. This is my shout out for the Daisy Word to EPUB plugin, because honestly, it's probably the best one that I've ever used for those purposes.
I'll add to that especially when you're dealing with government, it's not just about the creation tools, which is a huge issue, but also the reading tools, because certain government, I think all governments, but also certain private companies need to authorize everything that the people who work there download. So if somebody has an EPUB but can't open it, that's useless. Mm-hmm. And so with PDF now, everybody just opens it in the browser. With EPUB, they need to be authorized to download something to open it. And if the thing they're authorized to download is not a good user experience, nobody will enjoy reading it. And so we also need to work on advocating for pleasant EPUB reading experiences.
Well, the different reading systems and user experiences, I think, will be a subject of a future webinar, so thank you for that suggestion. Ken and Ted ask almost exactly the same question, so I'll ask Ken because Ken's question, he got there first. So Ken saw a mention of new media types that would be included in the next EPUB version. Have you identified any examples of those yet?
Yeah, I think one thing that has come up that's come up a lot is an audio codec that's sort of optimized for speech. I think people have mentioned Opus, I think, is a candidate. And there's a lot of audio formats out there, and I think people seem to have strong opinions about audio codecs. As someone who's never had a strong opinion, I don't understand that at all. I think, another obvious candidate might be, image formats that are being used on the web, like WebP. I haven't explicitly heard calls for that yet, but I wouldn't be surprised. So I think the number one thing is the audio stuff.
Great. Jan, I think it's hard to read. Yeah, Jan asked the question, do you plan to separate the 3.x spec into modules that could be supported individually by the different reading systems implementers? This is making them also possible to use outside of reading systems, so making it more modular.
I certainly see some of the appeal, but HTML went down that road with sort of the modular XHTML, and it was a confusing disaster, I think. I am especially sympathetic to the idea of what is the interoperable core of EPUB? What is the stuff that works everywhere? It's like leaving out things like multiple renditions and collections and stuff like that. But it's hard to know how to modularize things that way. We've already we already split out the package file, the packaging mechanism of OCF, etc. It would be hard to know where to draw the lines.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I've got some accessibility specific questions here. So one is a kind of straightforward question. Does EPUB type help with accessibility? Who'd like to take that?
Hi, sorry, my son's joining us. Does EPUB type help with accessibility? It was planned that way. Sorry, my son is here with us. He's going to help us with this. EPUB type was planned to help with accessibility. The goal was that if we included more information in the tagging, then assistive technology and other tools that help people with accessibility would be able to pick up on what we called inflection. But that never materialized. So right now, EPUB type is kind of a wish, and it doesn't help anything. So if you include it to help your workflows, please, I need to talk. If you include it to help with your workflows, that's fantastic. And you can help it, and you can include it to include information for your workflow. So if you have something such as P EPUB type equals chapter, all that is doing for you is including information for your workflow. No assistive technology is picking it up. If you are attempting to include information for assistive technology, it's time to shift over to EPUB ARIA or regular ARIA.
What
Right.
Svea said.
Fantastic. And then sticking with this theme, we've talked about the future, we've done a little bit of crystal ball gazing. What does this future of publishing standards that our panel have set out for us mean for people specifically with print disabilities? How is the future brighter?
It's a great question. We're really trying with the future, and so things like refining EPUB and audiobooks and things like that. We're really just trying to make it easier and easier and easier for content creators to produce better content. EPUB 3, we like to say, is accessible by default. But the fact is that a lot of publishers today that are producing EPUB 3 aren't technically producing accessible EPUB 3 content, despite the fact that it is easier to do so with EPUB 3. I think with us kind of making it easier for both reading systems and content creators to produce better content and make it clearer and clearer, like what are the accessibility requirements, what should a reading system, accessibility is actually one area I would really like to refine for reading systems, just so reading systems understand what they need to do with accessible information like the metadata or things like DPUB ARIA. By doing that, it means that people with print disabilities can have a little bit more confidence over time. And I want the end goal is to have complete confidence in the content that they download. But I hope that with these changes, there'll be an increased confidence that any EPUB that they download and any reading system that they use is going to give them the best reading experience for their needs.
Super. We're coming towards the top of the hour. In the moment, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to make a prediction of something they think will be really different in 10 years' time. So I'm going to give you a little moment to think about that. But we have a question from Austin here, which is for a person just starting to learn about EPUB publishing, what are the resources that you recommend to help with their development?
I would recommend, one, read the spec. Believe it or not, I actually do. I think there's a lot to learn from it. And the EPUB 3.2 is much easier to read than any of the previous versions. The other thing I would do is follow eProduction, hashtag eProduction on Twitter. That's EPRD, I can't see, TCN? I can't, there's no vowels except for the E. And the other resource that I would check out 100% is anything by Laura Brady about accessibility and building EPUBs, because she's produced things for lynda.com and on LinkedIn, I believe. And all of her videos have been immensely helpful to myself in learning how to be a better ebook producer.
Always happy to hear a shout out for a previous webinar presenter. Any other resources from anyone else on the panel before we move to that predict the future in 10 years' time? Any other resources that maybe Wendy didn't cover?
The books by Matt Garish.
Yes, and I think the DAISY accessibility knowledge base is one of the most useful tools out there.
I second that, of course. Okay, so then let's hear from you, and you can pick the order you go in. So a prediction for 10 years' time, what will be your amazing thing that you foresee that we should watch out for? And remember that we heard it here first. Who wants to go first?
I'll try because my kids are quiet now. I'm hoping, perhaps more hopeful than predicting, that we will have incorporated more web technology and have enabled things like citations and deep linking in ebooks.
Great. Who's next?
There will still be EPUB 2s in the marketplace in 10 years.
Don't say such a thing, Dave.
But there will also be web packages.
Yes, that's better. I'm going to be the wild optimist and say that we're going to see way more accessible reading experiences in the marketplace. That's just going to be the standard. I'm really hoping that it comes from all directions in terms of retailers demanding it and publishers producing it. And I really hope that audiobooks are produced using the standard accessibly for all users, and we just see really great digital experiences for books and audiobooks and content in general.
I guess if I had a wild prediction, it would be that PDF will be seen the way that Flash is seen now. That would make me really happy.
I'll second that.
Okay, well, we'll wait to see just how good those predictions are. They're certainly kind of looking forwards. Wendy, would you be good enough to move us to the next slide, please? So we're in the wrap up. And okay, we're coming to the end of this session. Svea, Dave and Wendy, thanks for sharing your great information and insights. And thank you to everyone who's joined us for today's session. If you missed the first of these two webinars, examining the revolution of born accessible digital publications, you can access the recording and the slide deck of Where Are We and How Did We Get Here on the DAISY webinar web pages. Coming up in the next few weeks, we've got some wonderful more topics for you. On June the 10th, we'll be learning about some legislation that will impact on one of the world's largest marketplaces, the European Accessibility Act, considerations for the publishing industry and benefits for consumers globally. On June the 17th, in response to many requests on this topic, we have Describing Images in Publications, Guidance, Best Practices, and the Promise of Technology. And on June the 24th, we have another requested topic, Metadata in Publishing, the Hidden Information Essential for Accessibility. Find out more information at daisy.org/webinars, where you can also sign up to the webinar announcement mailing list to learn about new topics as we add them. If you would like to suggest a subject, or if you're considering presenting a webinar, then please email us at webinars@daisy.org. I hope you'll join us again next week. In the meantime, thank you for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.